So I was excited to get the call from John and talking with Mark and John and Tom, and we began talking about what could happen today. I have a real passion for talking about visionary stewardship, and there are a number of reasons for that. My experience, I pastored churches for about 17 years, and then have been doing this ministry for 24 years. So I'm an old guy, and did my doctorate. It was really, the reason I did that was to analyze some of the things that had worked well and be able to replicate some of that with other churches. And so the theme of connecting church and community was a very important part of what I found to be meaningful, and you'll hear me referencing those concepts in what I'm going to talk with you about today. I've worked with between 350 and 400 churches across the country in the years that I've been doing this, churches of all different kinds and all different sizes. One of the things I do a lot of is capital campaigns, and the capital campaigns I've done have ranged everywhere from about $500,000 to $25 million, just everywhere in between there. Many Methodist churches, but many of denominations that you know, and some of denominations you may never have heard of, and I had not heard of either. There are a lot of different kinds of churches, lots of flavors out there. But I've learned much, and one of the things that I have learned is that many people with many, many different approaches are simply seeking to love God and to share God's love with others with a variety of different ways to do it. And it's always a privilege for me when I have the opportunity to partner up, and that's what I consider it, partner with them to help them fulfill their mission, to help them do what they believe God is calling them to do. That's my mission, to help you do your mission. That's what I always tell folks. And as I've done that over the years, I've been able to collect a lot of information and pulled it together for what I share in this presentation. And so I begin with that idea of visionary stewardship, seeing beyond the offering plate to old money, new money, more money for ministry. For ministry. And I think that that is a relevant topic for us to discuss in particularly our United Methodist churches. I'm an ordained United Methodist minister in our United Methodist churches today. Because in reality, the churches that I've worked with that have a compelling vision for where they believe God's calling them to go are the churches that I have seen are most effective in creating a culture of generosity among their folks. Everything I'm going to say is built on what I just said. That churches that truly have a compelling vision for where they are going are the churches that are very effective at creating a culture of generosity. So this is where I want to go with you this evening. Oh, and you do have in the binder there sort of the slides that are part of this presentation. I decided not to throw them up here so that we can be a little more flexible in moving around in that, but I'm going to follow through those slides. It's up to you to try to keep up with where I am, but you'll see this information there, and we'll move back and forth, and we'll do some Q&A, and I'll adjust where we're headed based on what I hear from you. But this is where I want to go. I want to explain why I believe a compelling vision is so important in setting the stage for creating a culture of generosity. And I think that has a lot to do with our 21st century context. Secondly, I want to briefly talk with you about mission and vision, knowing that many of us went through a season of creating mission statements and vision statements, and had a small group do that, and then we hung them on the wall, and we haven't done a whole lot with them. I want to talk with you about the importance of using those as a springboard. And then finally, there are about 5 additional pieces of a framework that I offer that I think can create the structure that will help you create that culture of generosity. This isn't meant to be formulaic. I'm not going to give you steps 1 through 6 to get there. I think that that's always a little bit of a problem. I used to go to, many years ago, I went out to, some of you may have done it, gone out to the Robert Schuller Institute for Ministers. Any of you ever go out there? And I'd see people come back from those, wonderful training for ministers back in the 80s. And I see so many ministers come back and just try to implement steps 1 through 6 wherever they were, regardless of whatever the context was. And so I always want to try to avoid anything that looks like that, because that gets us into more trouble than it's helpful. So it's not meant to be that kind of step-by-step, but help us to create a kind of framework. Now, let me begin with this, full disclosure. I'm a pastor at heart, and I love those stories that you and I use when we talk about stewardship. Wonderful stories out of the Old Testament, the New Testament, wonderful stories that we've been using for generations. 2 Samuel 24:24. David is sent to a particular location to make an offering to eliminate a plague that's in the land. He goes there. The individual who owns that land, it happens to be where the temple would one day be built, offers David everything he needs to make that offering. You remember what he says? I can't offer to the Lord my God that which costs me nothing. He can't use somebody else's to make his own offering. It's one of those first indications that when we talk about an offering, we're talking about something that costs us. 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, again about David. It's at the end of his life. He's handing over the throne to his son Solomon. He's handing over the responsibility to build the temple to Solomon as well. David makes an offering for the building of the temple, something he would never see and never use. And then he prays in 1 Chronicles 29 what I think is the most beautiful prayer in all of the Bible, in which he acknowledges all that we are, all that we have come from God. It's beautifully stated. Wonderful story. Or the New Testament, Jesus talking about what we call the widow's mite story. Or to whom much is given, much will be required in Luke chapter 12. Or Paul, as he's describing the Macedonians, their generosity. And he says to the Corinthians, see that you too will excel in this grace of giving and this kind of generosity. We have wonderful stories, and we use them. But here's the deal. While we have been using those stories, giving to religious organizations has been dropping precipitously. Each spring, there's an organization out of the Chicago area called Giving USA. Have you ever heard of them? Giving USA analyzes all charitable giving in the United States. They analyze where it comes from. They analyze where it's sent. Each spring, one of my colleagues, he owns a fundraising organization in Cincinnati, the Yunker Group. Jim sponsors them coming to Cincinnati to give a summary of their report. Giving USA, look it up. Something the woman who was giving the report a few years ago said was astonishing to me. She pointed out that even though giving to religious organizations remains the largest piece of the pie of all charitable giving in our country, giving to religious organizations in the previous 15 years had dropped from 65% of all charitable giving to around 35% of all charitable giving. You hear that? Charitable giving has continued to go up, but it's been being diverted. And I don't know if you're aware of that, but that struck me as something that I needed to tell you. And as I thought about that, after hearing that, and I began to think about some things that I had learned, I started to pull together what I'm saying to you today. Second thing happened in my life that's part of this message. For 3 years, even while I was working with a national organization, RSI, and I was one of their national consultants for a long time, and then I became, for 3 years, I became the vice president of development at a United Methodist-related retirement community in Cincinnati. And for those 3 years, I was very involved in and invested in the fundraising, the professional development world. Became part of a group called the Association of Fundraising Professionals. Went to seminars and started to learn a lot about what development professionals are doing. And I quickly realized that we in the church continue to tell wonderful stories, but we're not using best practices. But development professionals are. And so what I've sought to do as I talk to you today is to somehow bring together some of the things that I have learned from those days of being in that development work some of those best practices, some of those tools that are used. And I've begun to integrate that into all the work that I do with churches and have found it to have some profound significance in results and how churches can, in fact, grow a culture of generosity. You see, when we talk about visionary stewardship, seeing beyond the offering plate, old money, you may be aware of the fact that we are in the midst of the greatest transfer of wealth that's ever occurred in our society. As the parents of baby boomers are handing off their wealth to the baby boomers, things are transitioning. There is a lot of wealth out there. When we talk about new money, do we think about how to engage the millennials in giving? John and I were talking a while ago. Millennials, like as a cohort, are very generous. They don't give as much, but more of them give even than the baby boomers have. How are you engaging them? They're not giving as much, but more of them give. Old money, new money, more money. If I've worked with you, and I've worked with some of the churches here, you've heard me tell this story. It's a story that Paul Harvey used to tell. You remember Paul Harvey? Good. I can tell you will. I've stood in groups where it's all 20-somethings, and I said, "Do you know Paul Harvey?" And they just had a blank look on their faces. That's when I really started feeling old. Paul Harvey used to tell the story about the woman who called the Butterball Turkey Company. Have you heard this? Said to the customer service representative on the other end of the line, "We have a turkey that's been in our freezer for 23 years, and we wonder if it would be okay to roast it." Customer service representative said, "Let me check with some others in the office." Did that, came back to the caller and said, "I have an answer, but I have a couple of questions first. Number one, are you sure it's been frozen this entire time?" "Yes," the caller said, "we're positive of that." "Well, okay. Secondly, is it still securely wrapped?" "Oh," she said, "in fact, we double wrapped it several years ago, so it is." The customer service representative said, "Well then, we've talked about it. We think that it would probably be okay to roast it. We, however, do not think that it would likely have much flavor, though." And to that, the caller said, "Well, that's kind of what we thought. I guess we'll just go ahead and give it to the church then." What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that picture? That's giving the leftovers, isn't it? And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we encourage people to give more than just the leftovers? That's where I end up with why a compelling vision is so important. Because a compelling vision will help us grow a culture of generosity, help us grow stewardship. You see, I believe that in our world today, if we're unintentional about our purpose and calling as a church, if we think that we can just be the church on the corner and we're not very clear and articulate about who we specifically are as a ministry focus, then we ourselves can find our community adrift with all of the competing messages that are out there. I was thinking about this one day whenever I was seated at my desk at home, and probably like many of you, I had collected a number of articles that I was going to read someday, and they started stacking up on the corner. And I picked those articles up and I started to look at the titles. 5 things holding Christianity back. Why nobody wants to go to church anymore. 5 churchy phrases that are scaring off millennials. Losing my religion, the growing secularism of young people. And as I looked at those and I thought, what in the world's wrong with you, Michael? That's the kind of article you're collecting. I began to also think, though, if we don't really have a strong sense of who we're called to be and where we're called to go, we can easily be put adrift. We can easily be sidetracked by what we're hearing and the constant messages that are out there that question our relevance. We must define our relevance. Having a clear sense of what we're called to do, which is mission, having a clear understanding of who we would become if we're perfectly fulfilling that mission, that's vision, we begin to see ourselves in the 21st century context differently. Now, I know that many of us went through a season of creating mission statements and vision statements, and we've heard We know the many people that led us through that. There were Ken Callahan, Lyle Schaller, Stephen Covey, Scott Peck. Many of them had us do that. And probably all of us in this room have mission statements or vision statements in our churches. But unfortunately, all too often, the work of creating those statements was put together by a small group in the church who, with good intentions, hammered out some kind of statement and then put it on the wall and spent the next several months trying to convince everybody else that it was important. But I believe that there has never been a time that's been more important for us to clearly articulate what God is calling your church to do in your context. That's your mission. What is God calling your church to do in your context? If your mission statement doesn't reference the doing and the context, it's probably not a very effective or compelling mission statement. What is God calling your church to do in your context? And to see clearly in your mind's eye who you could become if you were perfectly fulfilling that mission. That's the vision. I always tell groups, and I do envisioning workshops. I'm working with a church in Cincinnati that I'll talk with you about in a few minutes probably. And I always tell them, people define these things differently. You hired me, so this is how we're defining them. Mission is what God is calling you to do. Action verbs. Vision is who you become if you're fulfilling that mission. Now, why is that so important in our world today? How many of you are familiar with the book American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell? Oh, good. Look it up. American Grace, Robert Putnam, David Campbell. They base the book on surveys. They are called the Faith Matters Surveys, which were conducted 2005 to 2007. So there are a few years on those, but the trends that they identified continue to play out. They concluded that unique among nations, America is deeply religious, religiously diverse, remarkably tolerant, and that landscape makes us in the church have a particular kind of challenge if we really want to engage. What I find really helpful from what they present is how they describe post-World War II America. They talk about how after World War II and the soldiers came back from those horrific scenes and experiences that they had, we started establishing homes and we became a nation of joiners. And if you think about it, that's exactly who we became. Civic organizations, service organizations, groups like Rotary and Lions and Kiwanis, YMCAs, women's groups, churches in the 50s. We just had to sit on the corner and people came. My father-in-law, who was a retired United Methodist bishop, passed away this past fall. He and I used to talk about his years up in Chicago, even though he had a very effective, successful ministry in Cincinnati for almost 20 years. He talked about his years in the 50s in Chicago, in Edison Park and Elmhurst, and how those were really the years that he felt like ministry flourished for him. And he said, Michael, all you had to do was really work hard to make sure you had a good message and some good programs, and people came and filled the pews, filled the classrooms. We were a nation of joiners. But Putnam and Campbell point out three seismic shifts that have totally changed that. One, they call it the sexually libertine 60s, the 1960s. Those were the years, and for those of us that those were our formative years, we know those were the years when we pushed against convention. We pushed against a lot of that which people had just accepted. And because of that push, some great things came out of those days. Civil rights legislation, many different changes occurred that needed to take place. But there was an unease with how quickly things changed, and morals were challenged, and a lot of different roads were taken. Putnam and Campbell say that first seismic shift in our society. And I can tell you, I went to a small evangelical college for 2 years, and I would hear them in the early 70s talk about how horrible the 60s were, and I thought, I was living in those. I didn't find them that bad, but they were totally against everything this group believed. Putnam and Campbell say then there was a second seismic shift in the late 70s. And in the late 70s, if you think about it, that's when Jerry Falwell in The Moral Majority, James Dobson, Focus on the Family, Pat Robertson, the conservative evangelical side of the church began to rise up and flex its muscle, began to become influential in politics. Robert Schuller built the Crystal Cathedral. A lot of those things began to happen. But Putnam and Campbell say there's another seismic shift that has occurred, and we're still living in it. According to them, the millennials have said, if that's what Christianity is about, I don't want anything to do with it. And that's where a lot of them have come from. That's where a lot of them stand. Now, this isn't about being on the right or the left, because there are a lot of areas in between the extremes on both of those sides. But it is about how we present the gospel to people and how they are responding or reacting to it. So what Putnam and Campbell have said is that with those three seismic shifts, we live in a very different world than we lived back in the 50s. And so if you and your church are sitting there thinking that you can sit on that corner and people will automatically come into your church, you're sadly mistaken. It doesn't happen that way anymore. I am working with a church in Cincinnati, in Madera, a United Methodist church. It had some wonderful years of ministry, and they sat on this major corner in the last 2 decades, and they now have about a sixth of the people that were in that church just 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. We can't just sit on the corner and think they're going to come to us. What they say is that with those seismic shifts, we now live at a time when there is polarization, and we know that because people are moving out to the edges, and there is pluralism. Polarization and pluralism that create a different kind of challenge for the church today. Very different. And unfortunately, too many times, we think we can just do church as we used to do it. And so, this is where I'm coming from when I say strong, vibrant churches have pastoral and lay leadership that casts a compelling vision that drives members to personal growth, ministry action, and generosity. So first of all, to move toward visionary stewardship, seeing beyond the offering plate, old money, new money, more money, to grow that generous faith, you need to define the mission and set the course toward the vision. Vibrant churches have a vision where they're going. There is something or someone that they feel called to become. In an article I read a few months ago, the author said, if your memories are stronger than your dreams, you're a dying church. Anybody know what that means? If your memories are stronger than your dreams, you're a dying church. So if you sit around and talk about what it used to be like, you're going to participate in being a dying church. If you talk about where you will be in 5 years, 10 years, with a compelling sense of how you're going to get there, you're part of a living church. 50 years ago, it was understood that the church was part of it was part of the American culture. It was part of the fabric of people's lives. But in our polarized, politicized, pluralistic society, that just isn't the case. So a compelling vision is a defining statement for a church. How many of you have a vision statement or a mission statement, either one? How many of you have revisited it in the last year? Good. I'm going to say you should do it every year. I'm going to talk about some ways to do that. But a compelling vision is a defining statement for people to sign on to, and this is scary, or to turn away from. When you define yourselves, there will be people that sign on. There will be people to say, whoops, that's not what I signed up for. And you have to be willing to move down that road. Most churches, I believe, want to make a difference. They'll do so when they begin to be specific about who they're called to become with that compelling vision. So the questions I always suggest churches ask is, who are we? Where do we live? What is God calling us to do? Who would we become if we were perfectly fulfilling that will? Those are on a slide somewhere in there. You can find them. Who are we? Where do we live? What is God calling us to do? Who could we become if perfectly doing God's will? Those are the steps when I do envisioning work, mission vision, and strategic planning work with churches. Those are the steps that I move them through. You can see within that, you're talking about connecting to the community around you. You have to know who that community is. One of the things that we have not done well in recent years is to learn who lives around us, to really know who they are. In 2006, I worked with a church in Manhattan, Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Tim Keller's the pastor there. Have you ever read any of Tim Keller's material? Tim's a great guy. He's such a wise individual, just a very faithful individual. Had a lot of fun being in Manhattan, but had a lot of fun working with Tim at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. It was about 2005, 2006 when I was working with Tim. They wanted to raise about $20 million. This is the story, though. For 20 years, Tim had founded that church 20 years prior to when we were working together. When we were working together, 2005, they had 4 worship services, 2 on the east side of Manhattan and 2 on the west side of Manhattan. They owned no property. They rented space on the east side, they rented space on the west side, and that's where they held their worship services. They owned no property, so their offices were in rented space. For 20 years, Tim Keller preached and talked about a vision for being a church that did not own property. They wanted to be able to respond to where the people were and to be able to pick up and go where that might be. Well, by 2005, suddenly Tim began to realize they did need to own some property because they needed a kind of mission center out of which they could operate. And to keep renting space in the Manhattan area was getting a little ridiculous. So they began to talk about what do we need to have and how much would it cost? And that's where we were hired to come in and help him. So did you hear what I said? For 20 years, Tim cast this vision of being a church that would not own property. In 2005, all of a sudden the vision becomes, whoops, we need to own some property here. So Tim had an annual vision casting service. He would rent space at a church in the area, and it was a Presbyterian church up the street this particular year. They would rent space. They had several hundred people attend in Manhattan on a weeknight to hear the vision that was being cast. He had been doing this every year, casting the vision so that people knew where the church would be going over the next year. I attended this one because I wanted to hear how he would change that message, that narrative. And if you've read any of Tim's material, you know he's an incredibly gifted individual. And he spoke about where they had been, who they had been, and then he started to lay out the case for why they needed to own some property, a facility out of which they could operate. And there was no heavy-handed dictate. It was simply a call to see and then to join in the vision that Redeemer Church was developing before them. And today, Redeemer has that facility. In fact, I think one of the slides has a picture of that. Their worship services are still remote. They're still out on the east side and the west side of Manhattan. They still rent spaces for all of that. But they have a mission center. And one of the things that Tim said that night that struck me was so poignant. He said, I want us to be a people who are described by others around us this way. I may not believe everything they believe, but I am a better person because they are here. Now that's quite a challenge and vision, isn't it? I want us to be people who are described. I may not believe everything they believe, but I'm a better person because they are here. Vision, a compelling image of something we want to make real. You likely live and have mission and vision statements that were created once, displayed for all to see. Do you revisit them annually to compare what you are doing with what you say you are called to do in the mission statement? Do you compare that annually? Do you refine them every few years with a new set of church leaders so you have a broadening base who are invested in how you define yourselves? Do you use tools available to involve more and more people in that process? How many of you have ever used SurveyMonkey to engage people in a conversation as you move planning forward? It's a wonderful tool to use. You can't involve hundreds of people in that process, but you can involve 20 to 30 people in the process and reach out to everybody else in the church through some kind of electronic survey. Let them participate and be part of that conversation. Most churches want to make that kind of difference. Do you make it clear that the resources you seek to raise help you fulfill that mission, that vision, so that people understand that the resources that they are giving are going directly to who you say God is calling you to be? Do you revisit that mission statement? Do you refine it on a regular basis? Do you broaden the people who are participating in refining it so that the same 5 to 10 people aren't always doing it and there's growing ownership? Do you involve them in a variety of ways? And then do you use that so that you can connect what you're asking people to give to who you believe God's calling you to be, what you believe God's calling you to do? I think that's doing first things first. That's why I talk about visionary stewardship. Visionary stewardship. Now, the second step to growing generous faith, the second step toward visionary stewardship, is to clearly state your case for ministry. To clearly create a case statement for ministry. This is what I would say to you who are pastors and lay leaders. I think church leadership would do very well, particularly pastors, to initiate this. To regularly take time to adopt the discipline of writing a 2-page document that makes a compelling case for the church's existence. It's a very important step of taking the defined mission and vision of the church and connecting those statements with the ministries that the church conducts. You may think your folks do that automatically. They don't. This is connecting the dots. We would do well to never assume that our good people who lead very busy lives are not thinking about this as constantly as pastors and lay leaders are. And connecting the dots between mission, vision, ministry, generous faith is something that we need to do in a case statement. Now, I've seen how taking time to work through this discipline really impacts capital campaigns. It's one of the first things I work with pastors to do is to create a case statement that clarifies and articulates the why behind a project. And I have also seen, though, that this discipline can energize entire congregations to live out their faith and service through the opportunities provided in that church if a clear, articulated, compelling case statement is created. So, a well-articulated case for ministry includes these things, and there's a slide in there that shows this. But a well-articulated case includes a brief, relevant history of the church. Why was this church originally planted where it exists today? Go back and do a little bit of research and find out what the initial mission was. What's happened over the years that have been of note? Why is that important? What I've seen pastors begin to discover is they begin to discover something of the of the DNA of the church, because you'll see repeating trends and developments over that history of that church. If your church has any number of years of history, you begin to see things sort of pop up. I worked with an Episcopal church in Dayton, Ohio at one point and helped them in some of this process of developing a mission and vision. And we created a timeline of all the things that had happened in that church life. And it was a church that had been around for 150 or 175 years, so there was a lot of history. And as we put that out on a timeline, suddenly they realized this had been a church that had started a number of other Episcopal churches in the greater Dayton area. And they knew some of that, but they hadn't really put it together. And they began to see how that really was still driving them in some of the outreach ministries that they had. But they didn't understand that until they began to think about their history and to become more in touch with that DNA. So it includes a brief history. Why was the church planted? Why does it exist today? Second, an expression of the mission, vision, and priorities. I've hit that enough, but that has to be part of it. And then third, a description of the perceived challenges, the needs, the opportunities that are around you. What is your context? What is going on around you? What can the church do to engage the people that are around you? Do you know what those opportunities, what those challenges might be? I was working with a church in Kentucky, in northern Kentucky, and the heroin epidemic was just rising up and rearing its ugly head. And they were oblivious to thinking about how they could connect into any kind of ministry. I didn't define it for them, but I asked, do you see any opportunity here? Is there some way to serve? Is there some way to be the church? What's your context tell you? A description of the perceived challenges, needs, opportunities. Next, the proposed ministry solutions to those challenges, needs, or opportunities. This is what we believe we're being called to address. This is how we're going to address that. Taking time to clearly create that begins to sort things out so that your church doesn't just look like a jumble of activity, but looks like a mission station with a purpose. What are the proposed ministry solutions to the challenges, needs, or opportunities? I do a lot of work with strategic planning on that. What are the costs associated with these ministry solutions? What are the costs associated? And then a closing statement, and this is very important, that focuses on the primary areas of ministry benefit. And the word here is outcomes, lives changed. Write those words down. What are the outcomes? What are the lives? How are lives being changed? That's one of the tools development professionals know how to use very, very well. How are lives being changed? What are the outcomes of the ministries that we're saying we are doing? What are the measures of it? How many lives are we changing? How many children are involved in our Vacation Bible School? How many children have we reached with the free lunch program? Don't feel like you're bragging. You're telling the story of outcomes. Look at the mail you get at the end of the year from all of the nonprofits around you. They're very specific about outcomes. We need to, on a regular basis, do the same thing. Not wait till the year end, but on a regular basis. We have a captive audience every week. How could you tell those stories? So that closing statement focuses on the outcomes, the changed lives, and the urgency of addressing the challenges at this time. The urgency of doing it now. Now that's very different. This is very different from a State of the Church address. That's a report that we sometimes write. But instead of a report of what has or has not happened, a case for ministry engages members more fully with the urgency to act for the future. Now notice I'm talking about urgency, not desperation. I sometimes have to steer pastors away from desperation. Avoid desperation. If we do not do these changes, we'll disappear in 5 years. That's desperation. But urgency describes the windows of opportunity to change lives because God is calling us to do this thing. Ultimately, this is an excellent process for doing first things first toward growing generous faith. Be disciplined to write a case for ministry. Take time each year to simply put it down. It will force you to sort it out. It will force you to connect the dots. It will enable you to be able to articulate to your church members on a regular basis. Does that make sense? Have you heard of this before? Have you done this before? It's a very, very important step. The church my wife Marcy and I attend is Hyde Park Community United Methodist Church. It was a pretty well-known church for a number of years. I'm working with that church. We attend there, but I also have a small contract, and I'm working with this church to keep the endowment in front of the church. So I have a small contract, and occasionally I'll make announcements, or I write some things in the bulletin. I also preach on the Legacy Sunday, we call it. They used to have something called Heritage Sunday, which talked about the past. I said, why don't we talk about legacy? Because it's both what we've inherited, and it's also what we leave. And so we started talking about a Legacy Sunday. And so I've been doing this for about, 8 years, something like that. And so I recently preached at Legacy Sunday, and I started to do a little research into the history of the church, and I came up with some interesting information that really goes right along the lines of this case statement that I'm talking about. The original church was built in 1926. Okay, 1926. So most of our churches that were built in that time frame in the late 20s went through a terrible time during the Depression. Usually church families had to put up their own property as collateral if they were paying off debts. All that kind of thing was going on. But it was built in 1926. And in 1926, as they were opening that building, they articulated something that they called a purpose statement. And they actually put it on a bronze plaque, so it still exists, the purpose statement for this church. Listen to the purpose statement for this church in 1926. It's so similar to the kind of case that I'm talking with you about. The determined policy of this church is that it should be a 7-day-in-the-week community church. Now, it's dated, so some of the language and some of the concepts won't be quite there. But just so far as physically possible, it will be thrown open for the use of all community gatherings, community interests, community programs. We hope to make it a meeting place for everybody and everything that has the highest interests of the community at heart. Questions of faith, church membership, etc. will not be raised. All are welcome. The program aimed at is of such breadth, purpose, and atmosphere that people will rather, quote, be at church than not. We want the youth and childhood to find their fun, their pleasure, their enjoyment at the church and just as near the altar of God as possible. We will be nearing our ideal, our vision, with the children and young people of all the community will prefer to be over at the church than anywhere else. We repeat that we're not building to make Methodists. We will be glad to have folks join any church they desire. What we are determining to do is to help people get acquainted with Jesus Christ and to go forth to live godly lives of service among their fellow men and women everywhere. Now, that was their purpose statement in 1926. Do you know what they built in 1926? They built a building, as many of our buildings back then were, beautiful Gothic kind of cathedral sanctuary with archways, and at the base of each arch there are symbols of how each of the apostles died, and the tiles on the floor all have symbols on it, wonderful ornate wood carvings up front, stained glass windows that tell the story of Christ's life, all of that, the kind of thing that we did a lot of in the late 20s. But they also built a little theater with a projection booth and a screen, late 20s here, and curtains so that small productions could happen in the little theater. They also built, beneath that little theater, a gymnasium. And attached to that gymnasium, the gymnasium had basketball and volleyball and shuffleboard all sort of drawn onto the floor. And attached to that gym were locker rooms and handball courts. 1926. They had a very clear understanding of what God was calling them to do. It's called Hyde Park Community United Methodist Church, and they wanted to be a community church. Well, I think that if we take time and move from the mission and vision and we develop that case for ministry, where we connect the dots for ourselves, we can help our members connect those dots. And we can be that kind of church in our world today, developing a case. Now, look at the time here. You want to help me pass this out? I have a document here. Let me have one. I always forget to keep one. I have a document here, and we're going to break. But I have a document here which is just kind of a worksheet. I've been doing smaller versions of this visionary stewardship to groups around Ohio and some areas. And after the first one, got a little feedback with some folks that said, I've never done this case idea before. Could you give us a little time to maybe try to do something with that? And so I put together, this is basically meant to be a little outline for you to take and use it. And why don't we take a 15-minute break? 10 minutes, okay, a 10-minute break. But during that time, if you can, spend a few moments and jot down some thoughts about how you could begin to develop a case for your own church. Do you know your own mission, vision statements? Can you take the next step and begin to put together a statement by connecting those dots? Okay, let's break. We'll be back together in about 10 minutes.